Well, I'm not specifically in favour of the mansion tax proposal as advocated by the Labour and the Liberal Democrat parties. But what I think is ridiculous is that someone living in a £2 million home, for example, is paying exactly the same council tax as someone in a £350,000 home. So my preferred way of addressing the fact that lots of people have become quite wealthy, not because of their own sort of efforts or hard work, but because they are own a property in a very regulated property market. And I think they should make a greater contribution, perhaps through new council tax bans, and that money then could be used to relieve the burden on the low wage who are paying very high rates of income tax. And as a Conservative, I'm more worried about our party reaching people struggling on £20,000 annual incomes than people in £2 million homes. I think a lot of people in the Conservative Party would not like higher property taxes, but I think housing is now becoming, perhaps, and I think it should be, one of the biggest issues in British politics. There's a huge number of young people who 20, 30 years ago could put together a deposit for a new house within 3 years. Some are now having to save 15 to 20 years to get their first foot on the first rung of the property ladder. And I think, therefore, higher taxes on properties, more building in places where perhaps a lot of Conservative voters wouldn't want there to be building. But if the Conservative Party is going to reach out of the 30s and become a majority party again, and more importantly, if we're going to have a country where young people feel that they can buy a home and have a stake in society, then we are going to have to take some difficult decisions. I think by the end of the process of fiscal retrenchment, the ratio should be about 80-20, 80% spending cuts, 20% tax rises. And that actually, if you talk to the IMF, the OECD, or the other big sort of people who've studied deficit reduction programs in other countries, in other parts of the world, in other times in recent history, that does seem to be the most sensible balance. And I don't think Britain has is an under-taxed nation. Most people feel that they pay enough tax, and we live in a globally competitive economy, and if we do tax individuals or companies too much, well, they have an opportunity now of registering overseas. So I think taxes have gone up overall as far as they possibly can, and we have spent too much. We way outpaced the OECD average over the last 10-15 years. We have to bring our spending under control as a nation. There is scope, I think, for certain taxes to go up and others to go down, a rebalancing within the tax system, as with higher council tax bans. But I think the overall burden is high enough. I think this may be the new normal, and I'm a bringer of very gloomy tidings, but I think a lot of people, perhaps in the public sector, certainly I think on the left of British politics, many on the right of British politics, think the big issue is austerity in one parliament. Well, actually, I think it's austerity over at least 2 parliaments. The Independent Institute of Fiscal Studies have said it's going to take at least another parliament to get rid of the deficit. The lowest hanging fruit has been picked. The next round of cuts are going to have to be more difficult, I think, potentially more troublesome. And then, of course, we have other factors. We have long-term factors like the ageing of our population, which is going to be very expensive to look after. And the extra costs of pensions and healthcare, therefore, are going to produce permanent pressures on every other government budget. And then the other, I think, new normal factor is a sluggish growth. I think Stephanie Flanders was talking about this in her presentation at the start of the conference. Developed economies have been growing long-term more slowly than they used to. Now, if they are growing more slowly, they are creating less jobs and they're creating less tax revenues, which makes it harder for government services to expand. But in terms of the revenue that it would generate, that's something that's incredibly important. Generally, I think if there's not a very good reason why something should be run in the private sector, with private sector discipline, with no politicians interfering in how it's managed, but actually being managed for the good of the business and the customers. That's generally a good thing. But I think privatisation, charging for certain public services that up until now have been free, most notably roads, new motorways, new bridges, new infrastructure, and making rail passengers pay a greater share of the cost of their rail journeys, and perhaps even some co-payments for certain National Health Service charges. If you're late or miss a doctor's appointment, being charged for it because of the burden you've put on the National Health Service. I think the sort of discipline that is going to be needed in order to get the deficit down is going to require some quite unpopular measures like that.